Hi and welcome. In this video I'll be reinstalling the alternator on my Moto Guzzi Le Mans 1000. Well, these are all the parts. I've given this a bit of a quick clean to get rid of some of the carbon deposits that have come off the brushes in here. There's a little bit of corrosion on it, but it still looks in fairly good condition. I've retracted the brushes by just lifting these little coil springs here and putting them on the side of the plastic housing. That allows you to push the brushes back. That'll make it a lot easier to put on. With the rotor, I've cleaned up the two contact surfaces with a plastic Scotch-Brite pad just to get rid of some of the dirt off there, and I've also cleaned up the bearing surface where it slips into the oil seal. So that's ready to go. You'll probably also, if you have it, use a bit of anti-seize compound. This is a copper grease. I'll be using those on the 3 bolts that hold the stator in place, and also on the bolts that hold the cover in place, because certainly there's a lot of moisture in this area because it's a ventilated cover, and the bolts do have a tendency to seize in place, and moisture does have a tendency to wick down them, and they can be quite difficult to get off. Some owners also use anti-seize compound on the main bolt that holds the rotor in place. I'm not going to do that. I had no trouble getting it on and off. I suspect that's more a northern hemisphere issue where you've got snow, ice, and perhaps salting of roads that you're going to get issues with corrosion holding that particular bolt on. Let's get started. Now, before we put the rotor on, I've just put a little bit of assembly grease on the back surface here, which engages with the oil seal. So we can just place that on there. Now, to stop the crankshaft from rotating, I've put a pin through the gudgeon pin through the conrod on the right hand cylinder, and that's sitting on a couple of blocks of wood. You could use the rear brake if you don't actually have the engine apart like this, and there are certainly other methods of holding the crank in one position while you do up the nut. Next, I put the bolt in. It has to screw into the rotor first, and then once it's through the rotor, it'll go further back and it'll engage with the end of the crankshaft. So we'll do that up. Just rotate the crankshaft around so the block of wood is holding this pin. And now we torque this up to around 20 foot-pounds, and it's an 8mm bolt. It doesn't actually have a separate specification for this. We're just using the general specification that's listed in the Guzzi service manual. Now it's time to put on the stator. I've cleaned up the back here. It sort of sits into this recess here, and there's a matching surface on the back here, which I've cleaned up with, again, with the Scotch-Brite pad. Just make sure you don't damage any of the insulation, because you could short out the stator if you take off that insulation. Now we'll just release the brushes, just let the springs pop back in. This inner one is a bit harder to see. And there we have it. Now we've just got the wiring to do and we're done. And we don't want to forget the spacer, which will just sit there. Now mine doesn't have the original plug here. It's obviously burnt out from a bad contact at some stage. I have cleaned up these connections. All that remains to be done is to refit the alternator cover, which I'm not going to do because I need to rotate the engine over to finish the assembly of the barrels and heads. So that's it for this particular video, and I'll see you next time.